Thank you all for coming. I hope you can hear me okay. Today, we're going to talk about the science of learning and forgetting. And in particular, we'll focus on games that form long term memories for students. I'm Anna Moss, founder of Mind the Test Tutoring, and let's jump right into it. Now, how to use this workshop. First, get something to write with. It could be a notebook, or if you like to take notes on the computer, you can open up a document for that, but there are going to be specific note-taking times. And on that topic, you don't need to be taking notes right now during lecture. I will designate certain times to do brain dump note-taking, which we'll talk more about. And this is a technique that I love to use with students as well. So a quick about me. I founded Mind the Test Tutoring in 2019, which is dedicated to teaching students really how to think, teaching them academics and test prep alongside research-based study skills. So the kind of stuff that we're talking about today, these are the study skills that I like to instill with my students. It really helps them become lifelong learners and just take ownership of their own learning. So about me, I spent a few years traveling the world. I was teaching English online. I also did test prep full-time in Thailand for international students, which was great. And a couple of years ago, I went back to school to complete my master's degree in psychology and education at the University of Cambridge, and my bachelor's is in linguistics. So that's me. Let's get started with what we all came here for. I want to open with a reflection question. And that is, think of a time when you personally learned something once, or maybe you saw something once and you never forgot it, something that really stuck with you. What was it and why was it so memorable? So take a moment and think about that. What was something that you learned once and it just stuck with you? And the next question is the opposite. What was something that you really tried to learn, but it just didn't stick? Why do you think it didn't work? And most importantly, what could have been different to make it work better? For me, I can think of an example of something that's happening to me right now is I'm trying to improve my Japanese. I would love to speak Japanese better. And I know that studying for half an hour a day and sticking to it is the best way to do it. And you'll learn why later. But a lot of the time, I just get so impatient. I say, I don't want it to take months and months. What if instead of half an hour a day, I studied for 3 hours and then I could just condense it all. And instead of having to study for months, I would only have to study a little bit. And I know that the study tools I'm using are not designed that way. And I know that the brain does not learn very effectively when we try to cram. And yet I got so impatient one time that I tried to do this, and I spent about a week, and it was just miserable because I felt like I'm studying for hours and hours and hours every day and I'm just not learning. So that, for me, that was a time when I tried to learn something, but because I got impatient and I tried to cram, it just didn't really stick. And I know what could have been different to make it better would have been if I was just patient with myself and I'd been willing to space it out. And we'll learn why that's important today as well. So think about your own experiences, something that really stuck with you, maybe something that didn't stick with you, and why that might be. Our next question is, what could active recall mean? Active recall is going to be the topic of the next chunk of presentation. So what might it mean to actively recall something rather than passively recall it? Active recall. Stew on it for a minute. We'll get back to active recall in just a minute. First, we're going to do a crash course in how memories form. Now, this is very broad overview. Essentially, short-term memory is only about 30 seconds. Sometimes some people say it's even less. Now, in colloquial terms, we often think of short-term memory as like, oh, it's the things you remember from the day or a couple days. But in psychological terms, your short-term memory is only 30 seconds or so. If your brain then decides, okay, this information seems vaguely important, then it will be converted into long-term memory. But often it isn't. A situation where you might have a short-term memory, but it just won't become long-term memory would be, let's say you're watching a movie and you see somebody in the movie has a blue shirt, and you might say like, oh, that's a really nice shade of blue. So it's in your short-term memory because you notice that it's a nice shade of blue. But do you really think that this movie character wearing a blue shirt is something that you actually need to remember? Probably not. So 5 minutes later, if somebody said, oh, what color shirt was that person wearing? You're pretty likely to have forgotten it because your brain says this is just not important at all. And so it just gets rid of it. And this makes sense, right? Our brains can't hold literally every piece of information we see. If we had to remember what color shirt every person in a movie was wearing from every movie we'd ever seen, like our brains would explode. Well, not really, but we can't do it. So this gap, this arrow here that goes from short term and converts it into long term, that's really important. We need to often trick our brains into thinking that something deserves to go into long-term memory. And then once it's in long-term memory, we then need to strengthen the memory to make sure that we can access it when we need to remember something. A little bit about the neuroscience of it. When we learn something new or when we form a new memory, our brains are actually physically changing. New connections between the neurons, called synapses, the gap between neurons, are forming in our brains, which I think is totally wild, right? You learn something and your brain physically changes to adapt to this new information so that you can basically access that information, which is now encoded in the connections between your brain cells, your neurons. So what this means is that when we learn something new, we have to be patient with ourselves because our brains are literally changing. One metaphor that sometimes is helpful is the idea that neural connections are a little bit like bridges. And that is that neural connections that get more traffic get built up and up and up until they're very strong. If it's very low traffic, meaning you don't really use that information, you never really recall it. This might be an example if a student learns a fact in school, but then they just never really study it, or they don't really need it for the homework, or they don't really have a quiz on it for a long time. I'd say that's a pretty low traffic memory. They learned it, but it's not really getting the traffic that it needs in terms of recalling it. But if there's something that students learn and then they recall it repeatedly in the right way, which we'll talk about it, then it really strengthens this connection. It builds up and up and up. So we can see here on the left, we have a bridge that is pretty low traffic. You can't really get across it very easily. This would be very difficult to recall that memory. On the right, we've got this very high traffic bridge that clearly the student recalled something many times, they studied it, and now they can very easily and very quickly access that fact.